Hey guys, Level Cap here, and today I want to talk about Battlefield 6's quote-unquote dwindling player count. It's player retention. It's gone from a massively popular release to losing around, if we're being honest with the numbers, around 71% of its player count since launch. Seems like a pretty steep drop if you just throw those numbers out there. How significant is this actually? Does it differ massively from past titles in the franchise? And is this even a bad thing, or is it by design? So people are and often have been obsessed with player count numbers, even if it has no effect on your gameplay experience. You can boot up Battlefield 6 right now, jump into a fully populated server just like you could on the launch week of the game, and you probably notice no difference whatsoever. So why do we even care if the player population has dropped 70%? Well, it gives us a good idea about the longevity of a title. If you take a game that was not particularly popular at launch and had steep player drop-off like Battlefield Hardline, well, when the final DLC for that game dropped, I couldn't even find full servers to play all the content on. So in that case, the player count numbers would have told me that, hey, you might not actually get all your money's worth out of this game just due to there being a lack of active players. It also gives us a bit of a snapshot on how much players are enjoying a game. So if you say, 70% of the people who bought and paid for Battlefield 6 just months ago are no longer playing the game, well, that means that the average player, in fact, the majority of players, are only going to get a few months of content out of this game before they stop playing it as much or at all. If you compare that to something like Arc Raiders, which Battlefield 6 has been constantly compared to, well, Arc Raiders has retained a huge amount of its player base. And so you look at that and you go, I think this game's going to be fun and enjoyable for many months, if not years to come, based on that data. And then you can make an informed buying decision or a time investment decision. So despite many people bringing up a healthy argument, which is that who cares about the data, just load up. If you can play the game and have fun, then it's fine, it doesn't matter. Well, people are trying to spend their money wisely and invest their time wisely now as gamers. If you look at a game that's losing a huge amount of player retention pretty quickly, and then one that's not, you go, well, maybe I'll buy the game that seems to be keeping people super engaged for a long period of time versus the one that's not. It just makes sense. And so I think the data is important, even though I'm still playing Battlefield 6 and still having a fun time with it. There is a reason why people drop off from the game, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Now, the Battlefield franchise is one of the most successful FPS franchises, and it's one of the most long-running FPS franchises as well. And when this game came out, there were very few what we now call live service titles, games designed to last forever. MMOs were playing around with it, but it didn't really translate into the FPS world at all at that time. And so you made a game, you made some DLC for the game, and then you made a sequel. And that was more or less the financial model of that time. And it's still the financial model for Battlefield and games like Call of Duty. So the game is a fun core gameplay loop. You'll get a limited number of new content being added to the game, but ultimately the fun comes from playing against other players. And then once that becomes a little bit more stale, the next game comes out and you buy that game. It's been solid. It's been working for EA and DICE forever, but it means that by nature, the game is designed to get less and less popular over time and not retain its player base like a live service game. And I think players are conflicted, if not even a bit confused, because the whole industry is moving towards more and more live service products, at least from a big budget perspective. Players are expecting endless content, regular content all the time, and EA and DICE have tried to shift the game into catering more toward that, but they really haven't been able to develop content at the rate that they used to. And the reasons for that are not always clear, but I've got some guesses as to why the content rollout for new maps and new features are a bit slower. First of all, it seems like BF6 was kind of rushed to the finish line. They got it out. There weren't too many bugs at launch, but it certainly wasn't the cleanest launch of all time, and there were some lingering issues with the game that they were patching up as soon and as quickly as possible. But it definitely looked like a game where they're like, yeah, I think we can get it out in time, but it's going to be a little close. And therefore they kind of launched on their back leg a little bit with maybe not as much content ready to go for Season 1. And so if we actually compare, say, player retention between Battlefield 2042 and Battlefield 6, Battlefield 6 has really good player retention right at the start, and then it starts to hit severe drop-off slightly after that. And I think that's because Season 1 and the lack of cool new additional content was really being trickled out, and it just wasn't enough for the player base. Now, the other problem, and one that for whatever reason DICE doesn't seem to get, or they just keep pushing forward with this weird philosophy on game development, is that they're designing the game with a shotgun, just blasting a myriad of features into the game universe and just saying there's something there for everyone. And it's like their idea is to try and capture as many people as possible, and to do that, just offering the most different ways to play the game is somehow going to be successful, as opposed to a focused game approach where they go, this is going to be the core mode or the core handful of modes, and we're going to make these modes so darn good that everybody wants to play them. Again, you could compare Battlefield to any myriad of games. I'll do Arc Raiders again because it's popular and a good comparison. They perfected basically a single game mode. They've added modifiers to it to make it more interesting so that each round isn't the same, but more or less it is one game mode per map, and it plays incredibly well, and they put a huge amount of time into refining that one experience. Now, I also want to float another idea out there. For a lot of game companies, if you have a live service game and a steady revenue source, that's great. They found a successful revenue model. But with Battlefield, if they're selling 20 million copies of Battlefield 6 within several months, I mean, you're looking at profits in the potential billion-dollar range for that company. And they go, well, made us a crap load of money. How do we make that much money again? You're not going to get it from a live service game selling some skins over time. I mean, unless you have like the most successful skin shop of all time. Otherwise, you're only going to get it by making another game. So there's actually not a massive incentive to try and turn Battlefield into a live service franchise, because we've seen countless games make highly successful first titles, and then they go, here's the sequel, and people go, I don't want the sequel. The first game was so good, and I've invested so much time into it and developed my character so much and have so much progression that I just don't want to switch over to the next game and do it all over again. Instead, I'm just going to keep playing the first game. And so they kind of pigeonholed themselves into this live service model. So while I don't think that somebody's actively going, we need to make player retention worse for Battlefield 6 so that players will buy the next game. Like, I don't think there's an evil person at EA doing that, but I do think that the fundamental design of the game may be strongly influenced by the idea of, yeah, we're going to make a sequel and we want players to buy that sequel, so the content is going to inevitably drop off at a certain point, and we're going to reduce the player population of the main game in preparation for the launch of the sequel. And even so, this theory doesn't necessarily support making Battlefield 6 less popular only months after launch. You would still want to maximize sales, so I don't think it's necessarily factored into the months right after the release of the game, but I will say it means that there's far less incentive to support a Battlefield game post-launch versus working on the next title. And while we only have one season of post-launch content to base Battlefield 6's support off of, we have many other games in the franchise that came before this that showed DICE really ramping down on their post-launch support compared to what we used to get. From my long-term perspective, I think Battlefield 6 is just carrying on the problems of past Battlefield games ever since we lost the premium support. Premium was the paid for all-in-one DLC package where you could buy premium and then you would get all of the post-launch content. It would be expensive, but it would pay for that content. However, you would only be playing with other players who bought that premium. So if there wasn't enough support for premium, you might get a whole bunch of brand new content with nobody playing in the servers, which definitely did happen in the past. And it just divided the player base and segmented up a game that's already losing popularity rapidly into smaller and smaller player groups. So it had its issues, and when DICE moved away from premium, the content rollout just never matched what we got in the past, and a lot of players were expecting more. And frankly, I think what they're expecting is reasonable for a game of this size, and as I mentioned before, DICE really hasn't made the changes to streamline their production better so they could generate maps quicker and cater to less game modes. If anything, they've made more game modes, and it's probably going to make their map production and designs even more expensive and slower. Now, the silver lining here, and something that could potentially make me eat my words, but I would gladly do it, is that if Season 2 just absolutely knocks it out of the park with a crap load of content, and at which point, if the player base population still continued to drop pretty drastically after that, well, we'd have to look at some of the other core issues of Battlefield. But it does feel, for the most part, at least on a surface area, that the biggest issue for BF6 right now is just an incredibly slow rollout of content, and players just getting bored by playing that same content over and over again. Anyway, I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on the player drop for Battlefield 6. It's not unusual given the entire franchise's history and how this seems to happen with just about every single Battlefield game. Do you think it's a problem? Is it affecting your enjoyment of Battlefield 6? Do you wish DICE would do some different stuff? Or are you fine with this sort of being the way things are, and eventually we'll get another Battlefield game? And up next, if you want to see my journeys in game development and working in Unreal Engine 5, check out this video here on 2 years worth of game development in C-Beams. People have really enjoyed this latest video. It's kind of blown up right now, and I think you guys will enjoy it. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap signing off.